Okay, let's jump right into our deep dive today. We're tackling a pretty fundamental question. How do economies actually work?
Yeah, and to get a handle on this, we've been digging into excerpts from Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics.
Right. Our mission really is to pull out the essential ideas, the core insights from these pages. The goal is so you can quickly cut through the noise and, feel genuinely informed on these foundational economic principles and how they actually play out.
hmm And this isn't about telling you what to think, more about exploring the framework and the arguments presented in this specific text.
Definitely.
And it's worth remembering the author wrote this material specifically as a guide for, well, everyday citizens, journalists, even academics in other fields.
Right?
His point is, look, whether we get economics or not, we're all affected by it, by the policies, and we often influence them too.
Ain't true.
So this deep dive is about shining a light on some of those economic realities that honestly can sometimes feel a bit counterintuitive.
That feels like a perfect place to start them. Let's unpack this. Where does the source material kick off?
Well, it goes right to what the author sees as the most basic concept, scarcity.
Scarcity. And he's quite careful to define what he means, isn't he? It's not just like poverty.
Exactly. Scarcity, in this view, just means having limited resources. That could be time, money, materials, land, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And the crucial part is these resources have alternative uses. You have to choose. You can't use the same hour or the same dollar for everything at once.
Right. That makes sense. He gives this really relatable example about American families over generations.
Yeah, the income point.
Income per person, adjusted for inflation,
Mm.
maybe goes up 50% or more, right?
Right.
But even with way more money, people still feel that pinch, the pressure from bills, wanting more stuff.
Mm-hmm. That feeling of having to choose where the money goes.
Exactly. And he contrasts that with, global standards or even just historical standards. What we call hard work now in an office is, well, it's worlds away from subsistence farming.
Mhm.
And he even points out, look, even millionaires feel scarcity compared to billionaires. There's always that constraint relative to what you could potentially do.
And that fundamental fact that scarcity resources being finite compared to our desires and having those alternative uses, that's precisely why economics even exists as a subject.
Okay.
It's all about how we allocate these scarce resources among all those competing possibilities.
So if scarcity is the core problem, how does a market economy deal with that? How does it allocate things?
According to this source, the main coordinator, the key signal is prices.
Prices. Okay.
Prices are like the messengers. The text uses a simple example.
Milk. Ah, the milk example. Yeah.
Milk can go into ice cream, yogurt, cheese, right? So imagine people suddenly go crazy for ice cream. They're willing to pay more.
Right. That higher price tells the ice cream makers, hey, people really want this.
Exactly. So they're willing to pay more for milk.
Okay.
But then that higher price they're willing to pay for milk becomes a cost for the yogurt and cheese producers.
Ah, I see. So it affects their calculations.
Precisely. It naturally pulls the milk, that scarce resource with alternative uses, towards where consumers, through their spending, are signaling it's most valued.
Which, the source argues, helps avoid situations like, warehouses full of unwanted cheese while people are lining up for yogurt.
Exactly. It contrasts this sharply with something like the Soviet economy, where central planners made decisions without those price signals reflecting consumer demand.
Right, leading to those infamous mismatches, tons of stuff nobody wanted, and shortages of basic goods.
Yes, and the text really stresses this isn't just some abstract point about efficiency. It's about the real-world quality of life for millions. What goods are available, the quality, the waste. It all comes back to how effectively resources are used.
Okay, now this is where, according to the source, it gets really interesting. What happens when you mess with those signals? When prices aren't allowed to coordinate things freely?
Yeah, price controls. The text spends a good bit of time on this.
Right. It starts with price ceilings, maximum prices.
Yeah.
And the big consequence discussed is shortages.
hmm The classic example used is the U.S. housing shortage right after World War II.
And what's really striking is the source points out this shortage happened even though the actual amount of housing per person had gone up compared to before the war.
Yeah, about 10% more housing per capita, yet suddenly a shortage.
So it wasn't just fewer buildings. The argument in the text is that the artificially low prices, specifically rent control, dramatically increased the demand.
How so?
Well, people who might have doubled up, lived with family, maybe shared apartments, suddenly they could afford their own place. or get a bigger place,
Yeah.
or just live alone.
Okay. So the low price itself fueled more demand for the existing housing stock.
Exactly, and that surge in demand chasing a supply that wasn't keeping pace because the price signal wasn't there, that's what created the shortage, according to this analysis.
And then there's the supply side effect mentioned.
Mhm.
Rent control makes building new housing less profitable, or maybe not profitable at all. The source gives examples like Melbourne, where construction basically halted under rent control, or Santa Monica, where permits dropped sharply.
And the age of buildings in places like San Francisco.
Yeah, and notes a huge chunk of rent-controlled units. They're really old, like three-quarters over 50 years old. The incentive to build new, or even maintain the old, gets weakened.
There's that really stark quote included from a Swedish economist comparing rent control to bombing.
Gunnar Myrdal, yeah. A socialist economist, interestingly. He apparently said rent control appears to be the most efficient technique known to destroy a city, except for bombing.
Wow.
And there's even an anecdote cited from the Vietnamese official saying something similar about low rents destroying Hanoi after the war. The book really insists these are empirical observations, not just theory.
Okay, so that's price ceilings causing shortages. What about the other side? Price floors, minimum prices.
They lead to surpluses, according to the text. The main example is agriculture, especially going back to the Great Depression.
Right, the government stepped in to stop farm prices from collapsing.
Yes, which led to these seemingly bizarre situations where farmers were actually paid not to grow things or legally restricted on how much cotton or peanuts or citrus fruit they could plant.
Because the price was held artificially high, more was produced than people would buy at that price, creating surpluses.
Exactly. The market couldn't clear.
So, whether it's ceilings or floors, the source argues these controls distort the price signals.
They prevent resources from flowing to where they're most valued by consumers, leading to inefficiency, either shortages or surpluses.
This ties into another really key idea in the source, doesn't it? The difference between blaming outcomes on individual intentions, like greed, versus understanding systemic interactions.
Yes, this is fundamental to the author's perspective,
Mm.
challenging the idea that you can explain complex economic patterns just by pointing a finger at someone's motive.
Like the example of higher prices or interest rates sometimes found in low-income neighborhoods.
Right. The common explanation might be, oh, they're just greedy. But the source argues, hang on, let's look at the costs.
Because the cost of doing business per dollar of revenue might actually be higher there, like security, insurance, maybe smaller transaction sizes, higher default risks for loans, things like that.
Precisely. And the danger, the text warns, is if you misdiagnose this as simple greed and slap on price controls or interest rate caps.
You might actually drive businesses out of those neighborhoods.
Exactly. Stores close, banks don't open branches, legal finance companies might leave, potentially pushing people towards illegal, much more expensive options like loan sharks.
It's like the difference between blaming the wind on an angry spirit versus understanding atmospheric pressure, systemic cause versus intentional explanation.
Well put. And there's that other stark example, the Soviet manager who wouldn't ship needed equipment because the paint color was wrong.
Oh, right, because he was afraid of getting 8 years in prison.
The systemic incentive fear of punishment for violating a bureaucratic rule totally overrode the intention to get the equipment where it was needed. That's a systemic effect.
Okay, so if it's not central planning or just individual greed driving things in a market, what is the dynamic force? What makes things change and improve?
Competition, plain and simple, driven by the pursuit of profit and the avoidance of loss.
The source uses the A&P grocery story, right?
Classic example.
Hmm.
A&P became huge by being super efficient, cutting costs, offering low prices. They served consumers well, and they thrived. But then competitors figured out even better ways. Supermarkets, then discount stores. They became more efficient, offered even lower prices, or made better selection.
And A&P couldn't keep up and declined.
That's what the source calls the unrelenting pressures of competition. And the key takeaway stressed is that the main winners in this whole process is the consumers.
We get the lower prices, the better products, the resources allocated more effectively to meet our desires.
Exactly. And losses are just as important as profits in this view.
How so?
Losses are the signal that you're not using resources well. The consumers don't value what you're doing enough to cover your costs. It forces businesses to adapt, innovate, or fail.
Which clears the way for others who might have better ideas or be more efficient.
Right. Think about the evolution of retail Sears with mail order, then JCPenney adapting, then Walmart learning and competing. It's a constant process driven by trying to figure out what consumers want and how to deliver it efficiently, Knowledge and insight are key.
And the source contrasts this with systems where decisions are concentrated, an aristocracy, a ruling party.
Where it argues tons of valuable knowledge and talent spread throughout the population just gets ignored or wasted.
So profit isn't just accumulation, it's the incentive that fuels this whole competitive discovery process.
It's the carrot. And
Yeah.
losses are the stick. Even though, as the source points out, average profit rates are often much lower than people think, fluctuating maybe 6 to 13% on investment over decades, never a huge slice of national income. But the possibility of profit drives everything.
Let's loop back quickly to central planning versus prices, specifically that knowledge problem.
Yet the scale of it is just immense. The source emphasizes, think about Soviet planners in Moscow. How could they possibly know the specific conditions, the changing needs, the millions of individual preferences across that enormous country?
Impossible, really.
Whereas an American executive, say, also has limited knowledge, but they get constant feedback from changing prices. And they have the direct incentive of profit or loss guiding their decisions.
So the information flows differently.
Fundamentally, in a price system, decisions are guided up from the specific local knowledge via prices. In central planning, orders flow down from planners with less specific knowledge.
The source even mentions the U.S. gas shortages in the 70s.
As a small temporary taste of what happens with government allocation and price controls the kind of chaos that was chronic in the Soviet system because they lacked those effective price signals.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to labor and capital. The source starts by saying labor pretty much always needs capital, right?
Yeah, farmers need land, tools, taxi drivers need cars, even comedians need their jokes, their material, that's their capital.
Capital helps labor be more productive.
It complements it. But the text also points out it can compete with it.
Meaning,
If labor gets really expensive, businesses have a stronger reason to use capital machines, technology, instead of people.
like the transit union example, wages go way up.
So the company invests in longer buses. Fewer expensive drivers needed to move the same number of people, substituting capital for labor because of the cost.
This leads into how the source defines efficiency, which isn't just about physical output, like tons of steel per worker.
Right. Economic efficiency, in this view, is about how well resources serve human desires and preferences, and those vary.
Like the comparison between European and American farming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Europe. Scarce land, relatively more labor. So high output per acre is efficient there. America, historically, abundant land, scarce labor. So high output per worker was the efficient approach. Different methods, both efficient for their specific circumstances.
So seeing Soviet workers intensively using boxcars or West Africans constantly fixing old trucks, that's not necessarily efficiency.
The source argues it's often a sign of capital scarcity. Labor's time might be less valuable in alternative uses there. In the U.S., generally, your time is valuable enough that it's often more efficient to buy a new car than spend endless hours fixing an ancient one.
Okay, so how does this apply to policies like job security laws or minimum wage laws?
The argument presented is that these policies, however well-intentioned, make labor more expensive for employers.
Which reduces the demand for it.
Right. Either fewer jobs get created, or businesses find ways to substitute capital, or maybe jobs move elsewhere.
The source makes that very blunt point.
The real minimum wage is always zero for the person who loses their job or isn't hired because their productivity doesn't meet the mandated wage level.
And it cites evidence suggesting these laws disproportionately affect younger, less skilled workers.
Yes, empirical studies are referenced, showing reduced employment in those groups. It notes broad agreement among economists in many countries on this, though acknowledges differing views elsewhere, like France. Examples are given from history, like colonial West Africa, where informal minimum wages led to no vacancies, despite willing workers,
It also discusses unions, like in the auto industry.
arguing that pushing wages significantly above competitive levels contributed to higher costs, made U.S. companies less competitive against imports like from Japan, and ultimately resulted in fewer auto jobs domestically in the long run.
And notes the shift in union strength towards government jobs, where the competitive pressures are different.
Because the employer is spending taxpayer money, not necessarily fighting for market survival in the same way.
And this all ties back to that core idea about value.
Yes, that value comes from what consumers will pay, not from the costs incurred. Costs don't create value. The value perceived by the consumer is what makes it potentially worthwhile for a producer to cover the costs. That shift in understanding is framed as crucial.
Okay, let's pivot to international trade. The source tackles some common myths here.
Like the idea that we need to protect high-wage domestic jobs from low-wage foreign competition.
using the India car example, banning imports from Japan or the US.
To protect lower-wage Indian auto workers. But the result described was Indian consumers paying way more for lower-quality cars.
Because low wages don't automatically equal low cost per unit, productivity matters hugely.
Exactly. A high-wage worker who's incredibly productive might have a lower labor cost per car than a low-wage worker who's much less productive.
Then it introduces comparative advantage.
The classic concept. Even if one country, say the U.S., is better at making everything absolute advantage compared to, say, Canada, it still pays for them to specialize in trade. Canada might be relatively less bad at making chairs than TVs compared to the U.S. That's its comparative advantage.
So Canada makes chairs, the US makes TVs, they trade.
And both end up with more chairs and more TVs than if they each tried to be self-sufficient. Total output increases. Both sides can benefit.
Yeah, there's always political pressure for trade restrictions, tariffs, quotas.
Because specific industries do get hurt by foreign competition, and they lobby hard. The source argues the overall economic gains from trade usually swamp those specific losses. But the losses are concentrated and visible, while the gains, like slightly lower prices for everyone, are dispersed.
And it says many justifications for protectionism are old fallacies economists debunked long ago.
Yes, going back to Adam Smith, the NAFTA example is used predictions of a giant sucking sound of U.S. jobs going to Mexico didn't happen. Jobs actually increased in both countries.
What about dumping? Selling below cost?
The source is skeptical. It points out how hard it is for a government to know a foreign company's true costs. Domestic competitors, however, figure out relative costs through competition pretty quickly.
So accusations might be more political.
Often driven by domestic firms losing market share, it suggests. And again, the fallacy of composition.
Yeah.
Protecting jobs in one industry, like steel, can raise costs for other domestic industries, like cars, making them less competitive.
And it pushes back hard against zero-sum thinking in trade.
Absolutely. The idea that if another country gains, we must lose. It uses foreign investment in the U.S. as proof. Foreigners take profits out, yet the U.S. got incredibly wealthy, partly because of that investment.
Both sides can win. Wealth can be created.
Exactly. It also briefly touches on foreign aid, raising questions about accountability and effectiveness when market disciplines are absent, suggesting it sometimes serves political ends more than development. The existence of large underground economies in poor nations is seen as proof of entrepreneurial spirit, often hampered by bad policies.
Okay, let's talk about time and risk in economics. The source introduces present value.
Which is basically how markets account for the future, how they value future income or costs today.
And it contrasts this with political thinking, the bus fare example.
Right. Economically, maybe you need to raise fares now to save up for new buses later. Politically, it's easier to keep fares low, get votes now, and let the problem of aging buses hit someone else down the road.
But a private bus company's stock price would reflect that future problem today.
Exactly. Investors would discount future earnings because they foresee the cost of replacing buses without adequate funds. Present value forces a longer-term perspective in the market.
It also mentions taxes, how lower rates sometimes brought more revenue.
Yeah, because people changed their behavior, maybe worked more, invested more, complied more, anticipating the effects. It highlights the difference between tax rates and tax revenue.
And risk. What about speculation?
The source distinguishes speculation from gambling. Gambling creates risk. Speculation, it argues, is about coping with inherent risks in the economy, often by shifting that risk to someone willing to bear it.
Like the farmer selling futures to a speculator.
The farmer locks in a price, transfers the risk of price drops. The speculator takes the risk, hoping prices rise. The underlying price risk already existed.
Present value also applies to lottery winnings or legal settlements paid out over time.
Right. The lump sum is less than the total payout, because future money is worth less today, which can feel unfair later, the source notes, even if the person chose the lump sum initially.
And this even connects to natural resources, like oil reserves.
Known reserves aren't just a physical count. They depend on current prices and technology. Higher prices make it worthwhile to find and extract oil from harder-to-reach places, increasing known reserves. Prices coordinate use over time. Insurance, of course, is another huge way we deal with risk, transferring it.
And the source discusses risk-based pricing, why your car insurance might be higher if you live where accidents are common.
It argues that forcing uniform prices means safer people subsidize riskier people, which can actually increase overall risk if it keeps more high-risk drivers on the road, for example.
Government disaster insurance is also mentioned.
as influencing where people choose to build, maybe taking risks they wouldn't if they bore the full potential cost themselves. And there's a sharp contrast drawn between private annuities, where premiums are invested to build assets.
And government pensions, where premiums are often paid out immediately, creating future liabilities without matching assets.
Leading to the funding crises we see looming in many government pension systems globally, a result, the source suggests, of political short-term incentives winning over long-term economic reality.
Let's bring it full circle back to efficiency, measurement, and values.
Okay, the source reiterates. Efficiency isn't just physical output. It's about satisfying human desires, which are subjective.
Like the wasteful gasoline use example in the 80s, 90s.
It argues people were just responding rationally to lower prices, which reflected increased supply and reserves at that time, not acting wastefully based on fashion or ignoring alarms.
And different prices for the same physical thing, airline seats, groceries.
Not necessarily unfair, the source argues. It reflects different conditions. A cheap airline ticket might be non-refundable or standby. A grocery store in a high-rent area has higher cost to cover. Different circumstances, different value, different prices.
It's also interesting how the source challenges the idea that businesses are always pro-free market.
Oh yeah. It lists examples. Businesses wanting tariffs, bailouts, subsidies, laws preventing takeovers.
Protecting themselves from competition.
Exactly. The source argues businesses, like any group, pursue self-interest, which often means seeking government favors, not pure free markets. It even notes business leaders supported Nixon's wage and price controls.
Nonprofits are also discussed.
As institutions lacking that direct profit-loss feedback loop, this can mean less pressure for efficiency or accountability compared to market firms that must satisfy customers to survive. Funding from donations or endowments can further dilute that pressure. Historical examples of slow change, like discrimination, are mentioned in this context.
And the difficulty of economic measurement is acknowledged, too.
Absolutely. How do you measure inflation when product quality changes so drastically over time? A 1950s car versus today's car. Or capturing the underground economy in GDP.
Or those statistical quirks like rising prosperity saving poorer lives, which can actually lower average income stats.
Right. It just shows statistics are useful tools, but they don't capture everything perfectly. They require interpretation.
Finally, that idea of non-economic values and greed.
The source doesn't deny non-money values exist. Economics, in this view, is the framework for analyzing the trade-offs scarcity forces on us, involving all values.
And it critiques the framing of greed.
Yeah, it pushes back on calling government taxing and spending for good causes purely humanitarian, while letting people keep their own earnings is labeled greed. It suggests greed for power controlling others has historically been far more destructive than greed for money.
So economics is about understanding those trade-offs.
Incremental trade-offs at the margin.
Oh.
Recognizing constraints. It's not about finding perfect solutions or satisfying unlimited needs because scarcity makes those impossible. It's about how we navigate those trade-offs.
Wow, okay. We have definitely journeyed through a huge amount of ground today, drawing from these excerpts, from, the absolute foundation of scarcity and prices as the language of allocation, to what happens with controls, the whole dynamic of competition, profit loss, the knowledge problem, labor, capital, international trade, even time and risk. It's clear these principles touch almost everything.
They really do.
Yeah.
And maybe, just maybe, a final thought to leave you with, something rooted in this material to chew on.
Okay.
Consider the idea that the core principles of economics, scarcity, choice, alternative uses, trade-offs, they apply everywhere, not just where money changes hands. Think about your own time, your energy, your attention. Those are scarce resources too, right? With countless alternative uses, the choices you make every day about how to allocate those, even without a price tag, well, those are fundamentally economic decisions. Look for those underlying principles playing out all around you, way beyond just the financial pages.